Hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of At the Table. My name is Jackie King, and we are in for another treat, real life friend right in front of me. But this time I get to be on the asking questions side of the conversation. Friends and listeners, I get to introduce you to Kate Shellnutt. Kate, welcome to the show today.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, I didn't have to do any homework prepping to ask you questions. So I actually feel like I got the easy end of the gig here.
We'll see how it goes. Yes, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, usually, and we're going to get to share a little bit about your life and your story and your role at CT. But typically, you are on the other side asking questions to me. So I am really excited to kind of flip the table a little bit and get to share a little bit of your story and life. So why don't you tell us just a little bit, kind of bird's eye view, a little bit about you? Where are you recording from? Tell us about your family, your job, and then we're going to get into the nitty gritty of just how God is using you in some really cool ways.
Yeah, so I live in Augusta, Georgia, and I can say that proudly because now it's the place that I've lived in my life the longest. I was a military brat turned military wife, so have lived everywhere, but now we've lived here for about 7 years. And I live here with my husband. I have a 4-year-old kid. And I have a French bulldog. Nice. That's our crew.
Just chilling out back there.
Yeah. So I work remotely for Christianity Today magazine, which is based up in the Chicago area. And sometimes do some traveling back and forth there and to do reporting. I now hold the title of editorial director of news and online journalism for CT. And a lot of my focus is news and reporting on the domestic side. And I still report and edit quite a bunch, but I also help oversee our online coverage and provide a little bit of direction and assistance to our global team as well.
Yeah, you do so much. So tell us a little bit of how you, I guess, really got into journalism in the beginning, and then how that ended up kind of shifting into you taking on a role at CT.
So I guess in some ways, like my professional story is a little more straightforward than my like personal journey, or my spiritual journey. I grew up as a writer kid, one of the kids who I was always a pen pal because we were moving with the military. I loved, reading, writing, like made my own newspaper for the neighborhood, was on newspaper
Did you really?
staff. Yep. Sold
That's
it for
awesome.
like a dime, tried to do like gossip of the neighborhood, had a typewriter, typed it up. So no one, I think, in my life who's known me since I was a kid is like surprised that I went into journalism. Yeah, newspaper yearbook editor in high school, and then was also a columnist for my local newspaper in high school. There was a time where like teen sections of newspapers, back when newspapers, one, were a thing, and two, had lots of specialty sections, but they had a really good mentorship program. So I got to know journalists and was like published and went through the publishing process at a pretty sizable, respectable paper up in Virginia called the Virginian Pilot. So I was involved in journalism and reporting from a young age. And then when I went to college, I was a religion and journalism major with the intent of becoming a religion reporter. And everyone would always ask, like, what are you going to do with those two things? And I was like, the obvious thing, your first guess, I'm going to report on religion. So yes, I also went to grad school in Chicago at Northwestern, and did some more study of journalism and more reporting on religion when I was there. But throughout that whole time, I really saw reporting on religion as a way to take interest in something I was so curious about and always drawn to, which is like the way people make meaning and have belief. And for a long time, it was from a place of like beholding from the outside. I was very envious of people who grew up with really strong faith convictions because I never had that myself or my family. So just to see people who are so devoted to what they believe in and to get to be, right, a fly on the wall in all sorts of religious ceremonies and talk to people, ask them questions about like, why do you do this, and make these decisions, you know, in your spiritual communities and in your own lives based on what you believe. That was like all I wanted to do and talk about. And I thought that I always believed in God, but I thought that that's what God would have me do, is to say, you'll see me in a lot of different places, Kate. Like, you'll find me a little bit here at the Shabbat service, and you'll find me a little bit here on Sunday mornings, or a little bit here, you know, at this meditational transcendental workshop or something. And so I thought that that's where God wanted me. And I felt kind of comfortable with that for a while through my 20s. And it was through reporting where, again, I was a religion and journalism major. I studied religion and scripture at a secular college, but like in college, I've read the Bible. I learned some Greek and Hebrew to study. So I was like not unfamiliar with Christianity, but just hadn't ever felt like God closed the door to other religions until I was reporting on a church plant in Chicago. And I felt just so clearly, I was meeting with this group. I think it was over the course of like 4 months for a Chicago Tribune story I wrote. And they met at like 6 a.m. on Wednesday mornings to like prep for a church plant. And they would study scripture and pray for, you know, the work that they're going to do. And it was a study of Genesis, and it was talking about the Trinity, being involved in creation, like, you know, just one of those things where you remember the exact moment. And I felt God tell me, like, this is truth. Like, this is the truth, the only truth. Yeah. And it wasn't, I was never seeking specificity. I was never seeking to commit to one thing. I really thought, oh, I'm going to be like a religious wanderer and seeker. And that's like what God would have me do as a Christian and a journalist, or as a religious journalist. But it felt really clear that that was a narrowing of all those options for me personally. So I did go on and I continued. I was a religion reporter at the Houston Chronicle and still had that curiosity for other religions. But over that time, I began to develop my personal faith and join a church. And of course, that's what led me eventually to CT, is becoming a Christian and being able to do it in that space. But so journalism was both a kind of way away from God a little bit, away from what God would have me, but then eventually to what God, I think what God wanted me to believe and profess faith in him and in Jesus alone.
Yeah. I love that. And even just I think how you phrased it was that purpose and what drives people is what ultimately just kind of pointed you to religion and journalism, and how that passion and that curiosity, and even getting to see such a broadness of how people worship and how people, you know, practice their faith, and just the big, broad scope of that. And then how God in the middle of it really just tugged at you and was able to open your heart and your mind and soul to his goodness and to his truth, I think is such a neat story. Like I grin ear to ear every time that I get to hear you say it, because it is such a picture of how God wires us and uniquely gives us purpose and passions, and how he uses those things to bring about life, not only within us, but then now, I mean, you're literally doing it for so many. And even you mentioned it a little bit, and I know you're probably not even going to mention the awards that you have gotten with Religion News Service. And I mean, like, but you have been all over, not only in the church and in religion, but just secularly, you know, within different news sources and journalism. And so just to see God use you and to see your obedience, I think has been really fun to watch and to cheer on. So I'm thankful for you and thankful for God's story that he has written in you. So you mentioned that you eventually ended up at CT. Like, how did that start? So, and I feel like your job there has really evolved over the years that you have been there. So how did it start out? Let's go there, because I think you even really started around the idea of women and women in the church. Yes. And that was kind of a thing that you were passionate about. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. And again, it was one of those things that I think God had worked in me beforehand. that one of the hangups, I think I was always sensitive before I was a Christian to the role of women in religious spaces. And I think maybe at certain times it would have been the way that I saw women used or not used in spaces that would have kept me from being a Christian beforehand, just knowing that from the outside. However, when it came to me joining Christianity Today, I had developed some like friendships and professional relationships with people there through the Religion News Association, which is one of the areas where I got my start in terms of some of the contests they run, some of the mentorship programs. And so one of my like professional colleagues on the religion beat is Sarah Pulliam Bailey, and she had co-founded a blog for Christianity Today back in the blog era, and it was called Hermeneutics, like hermeneutics, but with the her in the sides. Yeah, I'm trying to help for the audience.
I was a reader, I should say. Yes, I was a reader.
So that was a daily blog, like Monday through Friday, every single day we put up a different piece of content focused on cultural commentary. So it was like, what are the things being discussed by women, whether it was, you know, trends and parenting and international news and movie awards and like all those viral moments that now we really kind of hash out with like Twitter threads, or someone will get on their Instagram live and just say, hey, I've got a thought, like, what are we doing with this moment in parenting discourse or whatever. Those were really things that people used to talk about in blogs, and then really active like blog comment sections. And hermeneutics in that era was a place for that. So I came in and inherited that blog and was the editor. We had a team of maybe like 20 regular contributors. And these are some women whose names you would know, like Karen Swallow Prior and Marlena Graves and Amy Julia Becker. And then also other guest contributors would be anyone who would write like a one-off piece from time to time. And gosh, what a treat that I got to like my first step into Christian culture. So imagine I'm so aware of my blind spots, right? Working at a Christian organization. I have no VeggieTales. I have no purity culture. I have no DC talk so I've got no baggage, and I'm coming straight in the middle to my first introduction to a community of Christian writers and thinkers outside of my own local church that I had joined, was like these all-star women, right? Who are teaching and thinking and writing and commenting, who they're authors of books, and they're going around on speaking tours and teaching at Christian colleges and leading in different ministry spaces. And I learned so much from them, the specific things that they wrote that I had to edit, right? That I'm like reading and being like, wow, this is good. But also it was just a model of like, gosh, what, like, here are the gifts like of the church right before me. I feel like I got just this beautiful picture of what women were doing and could do. And so I never came in from the position of like, oh, we got to fight for it, or like coming from behind, or the underdogs in terms of women in American evangelicalism, that I really felt this like established place of like respected voices. And so they were like discipling me, through their work and writing, and then also through the relationships we came to develop over the time. That was my first circle as an evangelical woman. Then, I mean, at the same time, it took, as the years went on, for me to see the worst of that too, right? To see those women attacked online, their motives impugned, like them called names or accused or used in political or ecclesiastical arguments or whatever, used as pawns. And it's really like wrenching when you're like, no, that's not what's happening. So my first few years at CT were maintaining and running that blog. And it really was like such a special time. But I think both the internet like moved on, and then the church is in a different place now that I don't know that something that kind of special and pure could still exist.
Right.
And so eventually we stepped away. And there was also, I mean, I'd be curious even your thoughts on this. Like there was always a debate of like, why is there a separate space for women?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for us, it was because, well, CT had been a separate space for men all of these years. Why not like highlight
Mm-hmm.
platform women, have a woman on the site every day, develop her, let her write more for the magazine? We saw it as like an incubation chamber that, yes, they were still funneling into the main site, and the site we know was being read by men too. A lot read and shared by men. But we thought, why not make a special thing for women just to let them, have a moment in the spotlight, and to make it that. But then people would read it as, oh, this has to be on the women's side, and like see it as like a separation out. And so eventually maybe that's part of the reason that we outgrew it, and we just have women in their own in the mix now. But
yeah. Well, and I think it's so interesting as you're talking, because as a new believer, they are discipling you, but then you're also part of the platform of like giving their voice and accessibility in that time to so many women that are serving faithfully, like remotely, you know, in rural areas or in the city or in small churches, big churches. I mean, y'all had such a piece of being that kind of initial voice of displaying out, hey, look at what women are doing, you know, and these are their voices and these are conversations that they're having, to where you were able to kind of bring them together. And we're going to get into a little bit more, especially over these last couple of years, and just how hard reporting has been. But I'm curious, even as you look back then to today, how have you seen that conversation shift? I mean, and this is probably going to be a rabbit hole that we could do like 500 episodes on, but maybe even just kind of a general, as you think back to how those conversations and how those blogs were taken in and received to now, what shifted from your perspective?
Oh my gosh, I know. I think that I think that there were just a lot of times like fewer voices, right? And fewer outlets that people were going to. A lot of the places where people were early adopters to the blog platform and took off. I mean, I almost feel like you can't have this conversation without talking about someone like Rachel Held Evans, right? Mm-hmm. Who was from the beginning there as a Christian voice, and then increasingly as like a Christian progressive voice, who often blogged, you know, counter to what we were doing at CT Women, but in that same discourse. But I felt like it wasn't always this way. Maybe this is too rosy colored, that like, because you were going to someone's site, whether it was a site like Hermeneutics or someone's personal blog, that you were like, here, I'm stepping into your community and your space. And I might recognize some of the same people in the comments, and I might see the same themes come up. I kind of know what to expect from you, but I see value in it, and I'm going to continue to visit you. Whereas Instagram and Twitter, as that became a more dominant platform, it became easier for people to build followings, more people to build followings. And so there, you kind of don't have to be following someone, even, right? Think of the way our feeds are, to see their viral tweets in your thread and to say, oh, well, I have a thought on that, which you kind of wouldn't do. You would have to it takes more to like get to someone else's blog before the other social media took off. And so I think that that's really what it is, of like being a platform to host voices and to host a community versus like the Wild West of the social media discourse. And I say this as, I also ran CT's social media for several years, including when I was at Hermeneutics. So I know the whole, like for the whole site, before we had somebody hired separately to just do that in the last few years. But I'm not saying this as someone who hates social media. Like, I don't think Twitter needs to like go away. There's so much value, right, in the rallying and the idea of someone instantly having a voice, if they have the right tweet at the right moment, I think that's really powerful too. But it's just different. And I think that, it's made it harder. I think it's made it harder in a lot of ways to build community. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. And I think there's so much that has shifted because of social media to where it felt a little bit more like a dialogue and a learning and commenting kind of thing, to where I love how you call it the wild, wild west, because it is like, you just never know on Twitter for a day, or, any of the platforms really, like there will be shots fired from all different directions. And, I think even just the cycle that is expected to have to keep up with everything that is being thrown at one another, things being taken out of context, and this kind of things, where at least with blogs, like you sat and read the blog, and then had to have like a constructive thing instead of screenshots and, banter and those kind of things. So I definitely see so much has changed. Some for the good, I think, because of accessibility and more voices at the table, but then also more voices isn't necessarily constructive either. I think we could probably say that.
Yeah.
So you have to report on, especially these last couple of years, I mean, the sexual abuse crisis across multiple denominations, power, the weak, I mean, just so many things that are honestly dark and heavy and heartbreaking. And so I'm curious, because what I love about you is that you do just have this holistic perspective. I think it's not narrowed. It's not in an echo chamber. You can't do that in journalism, right? Like you've got to constantly kind of be listening to all voices and looking at all sides. But I would imagine being in your shoes and having the role that you do, being angry and frustrated and maybe even discouraged at the constant news cycle of it becoming a wild, wild west. Like people are getting shot down, like friendly fire. And I mean, all kinds of just drama and heaviness and darkness and sin that you are consistently having to sift through and then give a voice to and choose, like discernment in some of those things. So how do you, one, stay hopeful, I think, in the midst of a lot of really dark and hard news cycles? And then how do you see yourself really being a place of light in the midst of a ton of darkness right now?
Yeah, it's kind of always a good time to be asking this question, because we talk about it a lot at CT, like on the news team that I'm a part of. But especially good right now, because I'm in the middle of doing a project where I'm looking back at our abuse coverage the whole time I've been at CT, and then even prior to that, and kind of like reviewing what we've done in the past. And man, to go back and be like, there's been a lot. I mean, we think of some of, even to think that one of the biggest abuse stories that we wrote about, that was reported by my colleague Daniel, and later I co-reported and helped him out, but he's really leading the charge, was like the Ravi Zacharias thing. But that was just a few years ago. That even if you go back longer, and I remember the Bill Hybels year, we had like 4 different stories. Anyway, so I'm just saying, like, a lot of these things are fresh on my mind, that the clip has felt really heavy lately, but it goes back really far, that there's always been these stories. And one of the things we talk about is it's not easy for us. It takes, I mean, if you think, if you read a story and think, that must have been really hard to report, it's probably 10 times harder than what you think from reading it.
Sure.
Because whatever gets put on the page is what's been fact checked and corroborated, and that we are so confident in that we can use. But we've probably heard other stories and details that couldn't go on the record or couldn't be corroborated, that might be even more like gross or broken or sinful or worse. So there's a lot of things to bear. And then there's also all of the stories that we haven't been able to click publish on yet, that we're just in the midst of. And I have a few of these right now that I'm like, I don't know when this story is going to be in good enough shape, or I'm going to have enough sources to go forward. And so it feels really heavy to like be carrying those with you before you get to publish. But what we talk about as editors is that I actually don't know how you would do this. I don't know how the reporters at secular publications do this, or reporters who aren't personally Christian. For us, even though we keep everything confidential, and I can't tell my like small group who I'm investigating or what I'm working on or who I'm talking to, they know when I'm working on something that is heavy, and they cover me with prayer in that time, talk to me about other things, counsel me. And then I ultimately get the perspective of, I am not the arbiter of justice in this situation. I have a role to play, and I don't take that lightly. And I feel a real responsibility, especially at CT, to hold leaders accountable, to represent victims as well as we can. We know that our reporting makes a difference. So not to lighten that at all, but it's not only up to me. I'm playing a role in a bigger story. And so I have to trust that that it is God who will make everything right in the end, and that he is like the ultimate judge and justice maker. And so some of that is, yes, I want to do everything I can. But to know in those stories that I can't report, or that I can't uncover, or that even when we report them, they don't have the outcomes that we would anticipate from the people in power, from denominations. You can look at the Southern Baptists now, and I think a lot of the victims would even say, okay, the media, the Houston Chronicle, like pushed this whole thing forward. They had this investigation, they had this. And there are a lot of people who say, I don't feel a semblance of justice from this yet. And so even, you can only do so much, and it's still not come to pass. So I think that that's a perspective that I have to keep in mind of like, God's hand is gonna work on this, and to know like the providence in his timing, to know, to not feel the pressure to make, oh, you have to go on the record, or we have to report this, or but to say, we want to do all we can, but all we can do is all we can do, kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So how would you, because I can hear critics or people that are trying to be skeptical and saying, well, you're just dredging up, like the worst of the worst, or, you're perpetuating just the problem of like making bigger things. And you're very clearly saying, no, we are coming at truth, and we're coming at it with discernment. We're coming at it with facts. Like we're coming at it as a tool that God is using to not only purify, but prune in a lot of cases, his church, his people, his name and communities. And so what would you say to the critic that is like, you're bringing things up that don't need to be discussed, or this isn't your place, those kind of things? How much do you, because this is, I feel, even just in watching you, it is a passion of yours to be able to give a voice to victims and to give a voice to some of these systemic problems that the church all across the board has seen. What would your response be to them?
Yeah, I think two things. One, if your vision of how journalism works, or how our journalism works, is like us sitting in a room and kind of being like, what big leader or group should we like start knocking on the doors and seeing if we could like dig some dirt up now? This guy, gives off a weird vibe. Let's see if we can, find some skeletons in his closet. So I guess maybe sometimes some organization might do that as a way to report. We at CT haven't had to, because we get emails every single day, and DMs and reports from trusted sources, and pastors telling us, hey, this happened at my church. This happened with this leader. This happened with our denomination. I've got emails. I've got stories. I've got a court case. I've got a crying child, like whatever it is, that they are coming to us. And so a lot of times we do have to say, no, we can't report this right now, or this isn't, in our scope right now for whatever reason. We can't, I have news alerts set that there are pastors arrested every single day for child molestation and pedophilia and abuse within their congregations. Not 100% of those will appear in CT. So we have to use like some news judgment of like, all right, what stories are really valuable to our audience and worth us taking the time to uncover for whatever different criteria and reasons. And when we choose to set out on a story and dedicate the time to do it, these are stories that take, I would say, minimum months and months, usually close to a year, sometimes longer than that. And so when we're dedicating those kind of hours to something, it's because we have deemed it necessary and good for the church that this story be told. That our underlying conviction at CT with everything we do, not just with news, is that the church is God's force for good in the world. And if we believe that and we want the best for the church, we're not out here trying to say, what if we like got rid of all churches? Like we want the best for the church and for churches to be as healthy as they can be and flourishing and beautiful and God reflecting. And we think that that at times requires better systems, better accountability, better leadership, protection, sharpening, valuing, including people at the table, keeping children safe, like all of those things. And that these are stories that we expose and highlight and platform as ways of helping the church. And there are times that for some of these that we think by turning a blind eye as journalists, as fellow believers, we would be doing worse. Like one of the op-eds that one of my colleagues, Ted Olson, our executive editor, wrote one time was like, it's titled like, if you see something, say something. But there's a line in it where it's like, all Christians can understand when people do something bad. Like we all know that sin happens. That's not a shock to us. And sometimes it's even easy to defend or write off. Pastors are going to cheat on their wives. So some pastor somewhere is going to cheat on his wife sometimes. Some pastor is going to be abusive sometimes. Someone's going to make a step in the wrong direction, say a hurtful comment, whatever. It becomes a lot harder to defend. All of these people knew about it and allowed it to keep happening. And that's a lot of the stories that we tell. And it feels really hard to be another one of those people who knew about it. And especially in a case where a person that continues to be platformed and in power and could be teaching harmful theology and practices, continuing to cover up, continuing to hurt people, spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. We know that all happens from pastors. So it's really out of a heart for care for the church that we report this. We know that God shines light in dark places. We talk about that in relation to our work. And we know that God is a God of truth. I think that if we were peddling in rumors, in gossip, and things that were unsubstantiated, and things that were, kind of malicious smear campaigns, which these things don't not exist on the internet and in the world today. But we go probably 10 steps beyond to ensure that that's not what is the root of any of the reporting that we do. The people who come to us have evidence and credibility, and there's reasons to believe that the accusations that we report on are true. And so if we wouldn't tell the stories if they weren't, because we believe so much in truth. We know that that's still never going to be enough for people. There are some people who are always like, oh, it's he said, she said, it's two sides to every story. And it really isn't. There's concrete evidence, in terms of patterns of behavior, in terms of multiple people reporting the same thing happening in different places across different women. We see text messages, we see emails, we see receipts of funds going to, undesignated places. I'm thinking now of like these pastoral abuse cases. that like those things aren't coincidences, those things aren't lies, like they're evidence in how we report stories.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think for people, I would say, yeah, that we don't go out looking for these stories. That is not our heart to tell stories of like, who can we take down now? And two, know that any story that you see at CT or reputable news outlets, including probably the newspaper or magazine or publications in your town, that there's a editorial standard that these things go through, where they're not reported in 48 hours. They're not reported based on a tweet or a rumor. That for people to even unnamed sources who we use go through a ton of vetting. And so I'm not saying that you have to trust the process and take everything we have as gospel, but you have good reason to believe that we're pursuing truth and doing it for the right reason.
And I think it's really good that you explain that for all of us, because there is a difference in Twitter and what y'all are doing. And I think so many times they get meshed. I think so many times they end up getting put on the same level. And so I think it's really good for you to be able to share with us the due process and the work and the time and the credentialing that has to go with your reporting. And honestly, from a ministry leader standpoint, from a church member standpoint, for being in a denomination, like my hope is that we would have those things, because there is accountability, there is opportunity to be able to, like, who doesn't want to make something broken better, you know? And so, and I don't know that that's always the attitude that we have. And I think just because of our culture and our lack of trust and our ability to think that we have answers and that we can come to our own conclusions by ourselves, really limits the voice that you guys have. And so I think it's very good and very helpful for you to be able to show us, like, there's a lot that goes into the reporting, and it's not just an opinion or, hey, somebody tweeted this, so let's make a whole story about it. There's a lot of work behind it. And I appreciate you sharing.
Yeah. And I think I was just going to say, I think that we would all prefer to write great feature stories of so what someone's like cool Sunday school project idea is, or all of that. And we try to, that's what we try to have variety. We know that just like we don't want to read an abuse story every single day or write an abuse story every single day, our readers don't want to read an abuse story every single day. You'll see the scope of the church, we hope the global church, in the magazine. But I think that I can't think of a time from now to the foreseeable future where each of us on the news team isn't reporting some abuse story on our back burner, even as we have other projects going, that we don't have something that we're looking into or gathering thread on, just because we've got a long list of ones that have come to us that are worth looking at. So I don't know that if you're ready for this moment in church history to be done, I don't think God is done shaking out what he would want have told yet.
Yeah. And I appreciate you too, even just talking about the weight and the heaviness. Even as you were describing that, I was thinking of as a ministry leader and as a minister, you know, like, we know what it's like to carry really hard secrets and to be the one that sits across the table and is crying with a woman or a kid, or not necessarily in my context, like with a guy, but couples, you know, those kind of things, to where they are bearing, sometimes for the very first time, like the hardest scars that their souls have taken. And so to hold that and to be human, I think, and to be a Christian and a sister, wanting to come alongside that is a heavy task. And so I appreciate you even just bringing the humanity of your job, you know, like it's not, it's not like all right, let's go and see what dirt we can dredge up. Like it's real people, it's real lives, it's real hurt, it's real souls. So thank you, I think, just for giving us a little bit of a glimpse into the hard and the heavy, but also the truth that you get to share. We're running out of time. And so I think as we kind of close out, because you do have such a unique perspective and you have been, like all over, I think, just different denominations, different contexts, different communities, those kind of things. I think ending on a positive note from your perspective, I would love to see and hear what are you seeing God do through women? I mean, clearly we've talked about a lot of abuse, and what you've had to report over the last couple of years, and that the bravery and the courage of these women that are stepping in to help change systems, to help bring redemption and healing into different spaces. And so just real quickly, I think, how are you seeing God use women to be light in their communities, in their workplaces, in their denominations? What are you seeing?
Yeah. I mean, the good news is that, like, what aren't women doing? Like, where is there a space in the life of the church where women aren't leading so powerfully? And there's so much that I could say about this, but I think that, right, we know that women have always had a special role to play in what God is doing, like, throughout history. But I think in the time that we're at now, even with what I was talking about, like the moment the church is at with child protection and with victims, that women have just a keen sense of things. I think I've wanted to write about this, but I don't know how to nail it and get around. So not to get into abuse too much, because I know you want to pause it. Every abuse story that I've written, including ones where men were the victims, like when men were victims of spiritual abuse under a pastor. I'm thinking specifically, I wrote about Steve Timmis, who was the former head of Acts 29. And it was all these pastors who, like, they were being required to do all these crazy things for their jobs. They were getting yelled at, all of this. It was always their wives who sat them down and said, do you think that's right? Like, do you think you should be asked to do this for your ministry job? Do you think he should talk to you like this? And it's not just that women, I think, are abused. We know that happens by pastors. Women have a like a spidey sense, like a sixth sense. You know what I mean? Of like, when dynamics are off, there's a spirit, a conscious, I don't know. This is why I said I haven't been able to write about it, but women have a sense of when something is not right in an organization. And in the same way, or of when something could be better. Think of an all-male church staff and a woman comes on staff, and what things is she noticing right away, whether it's group dynamics, whether she's like, hey, let's sit down and talk about everyone's Enneagram for a second, whether it's let's talk about why this couch is in the lobby and not in the what's it room, that, like, there is a way that women are just instantly discerning, I think. And so when they get a space at the table, whatever level that be, whether it's in a denomination, in a ministry, in their church, the more that they are given a platform and a voice to welcome, I think they've got that innately. And that more and more you just see women speaking from that position to say, I can name what's wrong or what's needed here. And the less men have those blinders up that used to be like, can't listen to a woman because of whether it was sexism, whether it was denomination, whether it was, that's just the way it's always been done. The pastor didn't listen to whoever, the secretary or whatever it was. But the more that we're seeing communal group, like a teamwork culture in the church, and everyone's voice is just as valid, and people are less likely to have that shut down. There are like sensitivities that had never been, I think, touched on in these organizations that women are bringing. And again, they're not women's issues. It's just a level that women, like I said, can sense things. And that's where I've seen it in my own church here. I've seen it, like I said, in my reporting, and then just in different organizations that, like, they're keyed into something that men are not, I don't think. And so I think it's going to be a good thing when that this is like fully embraced and welcomed, that organizations will just be more effective, like more robust and more joy-filled as women do that. So for all the women out there thinking of like, why don't we do it this way? Like, you might be the only one thinking that. And like, God might be telling you to ask the question, right?
Yes.
So
I love it. Well, and even as you were talking, I was thinking of my book and the calling of even talking about lady wisdom, and like it's personified as a woman, wisdom. And so, yes, I think even just closing out on that, I love the reminder that we are only flourishing if we are doing it together. both men and women made in the image of God, and that we do have different perspectives and experiences and stories, and being able to bring those to the table to not strengthen individually, but to strengthen the corporate, to strengthen the church, to strengthen one another, and call out just what God is doing through his church and through his people together. And so thank you so much, Kate. I could preach all day long. Go girl, go. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time and just your stories, and even more so just your wisdom, literally, and being able to be light in the midst of darkness. And we are so thankful for you. We are thankful for where God has brought you and where he's taking you and how he's using you to be a light in the midst of darkness.
Well, thanks for having me. This is great.
Yes. I know you guys are encouraged after hearing Kate and her story. We will make sure to put in the show notes how you can follow her on Twitter and be able to just see all of the ways that God is using her at CT. And I hope that you will join us next week for another episode of At the Table. We'll see you then.